Nearly 3 million Americans are facing a homelessness crisis, and the numbers continue to rise with each passing year. Alongside this, nearly 42 million Americans live below the poverty line, struggling to make ends meet in an economy that seems to be working against them. Yet, despite these glaring domestic issues, the American government has historically focused more on foreign affairs, channeling vast amounts of money, resources, and attention toward international conflicts while neglecting crises at home. This pattern has left the nation in a continuous state of domestic turmoil, with homelessness and poverty worsening as national priorities are directed elsewhere. The roots of this crisis can be traced back to the early 2000s, particularly following the events of 2001. By 2004, the country began experiencing an unusual spike in inflation, and alongside it, the number of homeless individuals began to rise at an alarming rate. In 2001, an estimated 151,475 people in the U.S. were homeless. Fast forward to 2025, and the percentage increase in the homeless population is staggering. What was once a crisis primarily affecting the most impoverished Americans has now begun to engulf middle-class families as well. The rising cost of living, combined with economic instability, has left even those who once enjoyed financial security teetering on the edge of homelessness. But why did inflation rise so sharply in 2004, and how has it continued to climb? The answer lies in government priorities and external conflicts. While the rationale was national security, the result was an era of international entanglement, from Afghanistan and Iraq to Libya and Syria, costing the U.S. trillions of dollars. The direct consequence of these overseas interventions has been the reallocation of resources away from domestic programs. The decision of the United States government to invade Iraq and Afghanistan has had profound and long-lasting consequences, both economically and socially. While many analysts argue about the political and strategic implications of these wars, one of the most pressing concerns remains the financial burden they have placed on the nation. At the time of these invasions, the cost amounted to approximately $5 trillion, with $3 trillion being spent on Afghanistan alone. Adjusted for current inflation, this figure would be closer to $10 trillion, an astronomical sum that continues to weigh heavily on the country's economy. The financial strain of these wars pushed the government deeper into debt, a burden that still looms large over the economy. The cost was not just immediate. It continues to accumulate through interest payments, veterans' care, and other long-term expenditures. This level of deficit spending has significantly contributed to the nation's current debt crisis of $36.22 trillion, forcing the government to borrow even more to sustain basic operations. As debt grows, so does inflation, a direct consequence of excessive credit marking. The more the government borrows, the more the economy feels the weight of inflationary pressure. This, in turn, erodes the purchasing power of ordinary citizens, leading to higher costs for goods and services. The cycle of debt and inflation creates a fragile economic environment where lower and middle-income households bear the brunt of financial instability. Inflation does not just mean higher prices. It signifies a deeper crisis of the American people, particularly for those already struggling to make ends meet. Inflation has played a direct role in exacerbating the homelessness crisis. While historically, homelessness was more prevalent among the poorest demographics, the crisis has now crept into the middle class. Families that once had stable incomes now find themselves unable to afford housing due to rising costs. The role of international conflicts in domestic economic instability cannot be ignored. The recent Russia-Ukraine war has further intensified economic hardship, driving up energy prices and exacerbating inflationary pressures. With the United States heavily involved in supplying aid and resources to Ukraine, domestic issues continue to be pushed aside. If future administrations, particularly under figures like Donald Trump, engage in new military conflicts, such as potential war with Iran, the situation will likely worsen. War inevitably leads to increased government spending on defense, rising oil prices, and economic disruptions that disproportionately affect lower and middle-class Americans. The government's biggest betrayal, America's $12 trillion mistake. The United States has engaged in numerous wars over the past several decades, Yet it remains unclear whether the government has truly learned from these conflicts. With each new administration, we see the cycle of war repeat itself, draining American taxpayers of their hard-earned dollars while neglecting pressing domestic issues. As the war in Afghanistan came to a close, another conflict emerged, the Russia-Ukraine war, which began soon after the Biden administration took office. The United States has allocated nearly $400 billion in support of Ukraine, continuing its long-standing practice of financing wars rather than addressing internal challenges such as poverty and homelessness. Under the Trump administration, there was a momentary shift, providing hope that funds could be redirected toward essential services like food security. However, as with previous administrations, the threat of another war looms large. The Middle East remains a volatile region, and there is increasing fear of yet another conflict, particularly involving Iran. The potential ramifications of such a war are catastrophic, both in terms of financial burden and global stability. If the United States were to engage in military action against Iran, experts estimate the cost to be between $10 trillion and $12 trillion, a staggering amount that would further devastate the American economy. Lessons from past wars should guide future decisions, yet history suggests otherwise. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan demonstrated the immense financial and human costs of prolonged military engagement. Iraq, a divided state with a government detached from its people, still required trillions of dollars in war expenditures. In contrast, Iran possesses a strong and unified military with advanced weapon production capabilities. A war against Iran would not only be exponentially more expensive, but would also result in significant losses for the United States. China wins, America pays. The cost of U.S. military obsession. One of the key beneficiaries of America's costly war efforts has been China. As the U.S. depletes its resources fighting wars in foreign lands, China continues to grow economically and militarily. If the U.S. engages in another war, particularly one aimed at supporting Israel, it would further weaken its standing in the global economic hierarchy. While Israel is a long-standing ally, the responsibility of safeguarding security should not fall solely on American taxpayers. In 2024 alone, the U.S. provided $50 billion in aid to Israel. While alliances are crucial, the American people should question whether it is justifiable to compromise their own economic well-being and future for the sake of another nation. The financial strain of war has dire consequences on domestic issues, particularly homelessness. The U.S. has long struggled with a growing homelessness crisis, exacerbated by rising living costs and insufficient social support systems. In 2001, amidst the war on terror, many Americans found themselves homeless due to the economic fallout of military expenditures. Today, millions of children in the U.S. are homeless, yet the government continues to prioritize war spending over resolving this humanitarian crisis. If the U.S. government had redirected even a fraction of its military budget toward social programs, countless lives could have been improved. Investments in affordable housing, healthcare, and education could uplift millions of struggling Americans. Instead, the cycle of war continues, consuming trillions of dollars that could otherwise be used to build a stronger, more equitable society. Despite decades of war, the American people continue to bear the burden of these conflicts without reaping any tangible benefits. The notion of fighting for democracy and global stability often serves as a facade for geopolitical maneuvering and economic interests. A key question remains: why must Americans foot the bill for wars that do not directly serve their interests? Each time a new administration comes into power, promises of peace and diplomacy are made, yet the reality remains unchanged. Military conflicts persist, national debt rises, and the American middle class continues to shrink under the weight of economic instability. The most pressing threat to America's future is not an external enemy, but rather the misallocation of resources. With homelessness at an all-time high and millions struggling to afford basic necessities, the government must reassess its priorities. The resources exist to provide solutions, yet they are consistently funneled into military ventures rather than domestic improvement. If the United States continues on its current trajectory, the economic consequences will be dire. The national debt is already at unsustainable levels, and further military spending will only exacerbate the problem. China, a key competitor, has strategically focused on economic expansion rather than military conflicts, allowing it to emerge as a dominant global power. If the U.S. wishes to maintain its status as a world leader, it must prioritize economic stability and invest in its own people rather than perpetuate costly wars. 2030 Nightmare: Why the U.S. will still be losing the war on homelessness. The United States faces a multifaceted homelessness crisis, one that has only worsened over the past few decades. Despite the growing urgency to address the issue, it remains unlikely that the U.S. will be able to significantly resolve its homelessness crisis by 2030, especially if it continues to prioritize military intervention and war efforts abroad. The nation has devoted trillions of dollars to defense and military operations under the guise of foreign aid and global peacekeeping, yet it struggles to allocate sufficient resources to tackle pressing domestic challenges like homelessness. The dissonance between funding war efforts and addressing the dire needs of the homeless population reflects a deep-rooted issue in how priorities are set, and it is this very imbalance that presents a substantial obstacle to solving homelessness. The defense budget of the United States is staggeringly high. The rationale often put forth is that these wars are necessary for national security or to stabilize regions that might otherwise pose a threat to the U.S. However, the question arises, if the government can afford to spend trillions of dollars abroad, why does it struggle to invest in the well-being of its own citizens, particularly the most vulnerable populations like the homeless? A closer examination reveals that the cost of war has grown exponentially over the years. From the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to ongoing military engagements in various parts of the world, the U.S. has committed enormous financial resources that could otherwise be used to address domestic crises. The money spent on military interventions, weapons procurement, and overseas operations dwarfs the amounts allocated for programs aimed at tackling homelessness, affordable housing, and mental health services. A report from the Cost of War Project estimates that the U.S. has spent over $8 trillion on post-9/11 wars, a sum that could have fundamentally transformed the infrastructure of the nation's social safety net. Instead, much of the money earmarked for foreign conflicts is used to maintain military operations in unstable regions. Despite repeated promises from both political parties to address homelessness, the funding necessary to make a real difference remains out of reach, as national priorities continue to tilt toward military expenditures. Local governments and advocacy organizations often find themselves competing for a shrinking pool of resources, while federal funding for housing and homelessness initiatives lags far behind. This stark contrast highlights an underlying systemic issue. The U.S. government's priorities do not align with the needs of its most vulnerable citizens. Moreover, the focus on war abroad diverts attention from domestic issues. Political leaders, rather than addressing the root causes of homelessness, such as affordable housing shortages, income inequality, and lack of access to mental health care, are more inclined to support policies that perpetuate militarization. The rhetoric surrounding national security often overshadows the urgent calls for social reform, and the result is a public discourse that prioritizes military might over human well-being. This misalignment contributes to a cycle where, instead of investing in the future of its own citizens. The shocking truth about homelessness in 2030. By 2030, it is highly unlikely that the U.S. will be able to reverse its homelessness crisis if the status quo persists. The nation's failure to seriously confront the human costs of war, both at home and abroad, further entrenches the systems that allow homelessness to thrive. Until the U.S. reorients its priorities, shifting away from endless war and toward robust investments in domestic social programs, the homeless crisis will continue to be exacerbated. The inability to break free from the cycle of foreign intervention and military spending undermines the very foundation of society that claims to care about its citizens. The homeless population will likely continue to grow, not only due to the lack of affordable housing and health care, but also because the funds that could have alleviated their suffering are being siphoned off to distant wars that do little to address the root causes of instability at home. In conclusion, if the United States cannot end its costly and endless wars abroad, it will remain incapable of solving its homelessness crisis by 2030. The enormous sums spent on defense are a significant barrier to the much-needed investments in housing, healthcare, and social services that could make a real difference for homeless Americans. Without a shift in national priorities, homelessness will persist, and the U.S. will continue to struggle with its moral and practical responsibility to address this growing crisis.